For over 20 years, the corporate colours of British Rail Blue dominated the UK's railway network, presenting a unified identity for the nationalised train operator from the mid-1960s to the mid-1980s, and thus becoming one of the most recognisable and enduring parts of the once vast state-owned railway system, representing both its early triumph but also the malaise of limited subsidies and vital innovation tempered by political urgency. Before the paint was mixed and the first carriage rolled out in 1964, the case for what became British Rail Blue had already been made by circumstance and strategy, with British Railways entering the 1960s with a reputation in tatters after the modernisation plans squandered vast sums and left little coherence in its wake, with the organisation looking expensive, confused and defensive. The BR brand was toxic in Whitehall and distrusted by the public, a symbol of drift at a time when the nation expected purposeful renewal, and if the railway was to win political backing and paying passengers, it needed to look competent, contemporary and united, not just in the board papers, but at the platform edge and in every photograph that reached the morning papers, with colour, type and symbol doing what timetables and balance sheets could not. The existing visual language was a muddle of inherited heraldry and region-by-region improvisation that spoke to the comfort of tradition rather than the demands of a competitive transport market, with maroon carriages with delicate lining, lions and wheels, and charming station totems in gill sands, all speaking of steam-era nostalgia rather than post-war modernity, being handsome but fussy, and contradicted the message of efficiency the railway desperately needed to project. Worse still, the individual regions had begun painting stock in whatever colours they fancied, an inadvertent admission that the nationalised system lacked central control, with passengers boarding in one part of the country and alighting in another, potentially experiencing a parade of liveries without ever meeting a single coherent idea of what British Railways stood for, and thus a single standardised livery was therefore not an aesthetic indulgence but a management tool. Dr. Richard Beeching's arrival in 1961 sharpened that imperative and gave it political cover, with Beeching, as a ruthless moderniser, understanding that a corporate identity could discipline behaviour as much as it decorated surfaces, and he wanted a railway that worked to modern business principles, and by extension looked fit for this purpose, abandoning ornate lining, crests and fussy contrasts in favour of a spare industrial palette that aligned British Railways with the clean geometry then shaping British product and interior design. The new look needed to be reproducible in depots across the network by ordinary painters with ordinary equipment, and it needed to survive weather, soot and hard use without becoming a shabby parody of itself, with the choice of a deep greyish blue, variously labelled rail blue or monostral blue, being sober rather than showy, businesslike rather than bucolic, and distinct enough to be recognised at a glance, yet restrained enough to avoid dating itself with passing fashions. Practicalities pushed in the same direction, and gave the colour a hard-headed rationale, with a dark blue concealing grime on hard-work diesel and electric fleets better than lighter colours, reducing the visible penalty of infrequent cleaning and helping rolling stock present acceptability between washes when resources were thin, while the elimination of lining out and the use of large flat colour fields simplified painting and cut costs in shops already struggling with inconsistent standards, while also speeding up turnarounds after overhaul. With the use of one finish that could be sprayed or brushed, one specification for procurement, and one set of stencils for numbers, each of these decisions shaved time and money without inviting argument at regional level, while safety regulations dictated yellow ends, offsetting an otherwise restrained body colour with warning panels that were conspicuous without complicating the scheme elsewhere. Standardisation joined practicality and broadened the ambition beyond paint, with a limited palette blue, light grey, black and white, with red reserved for sparing highlights, thus promising economies in procurement and application, and made mixed formations look deliberate rather than accidental, while trains marshalled from vehicles of varied origin would still appear as parts of a single system, an assurance of reliability in visual form. In April 1964, Rail Blue was publicly presented with the XP64 demonstration train, a rolling manifesto for a new corporate identity consisting of newly built Class 47, D1733, later 47853, and 8 coaches, with XP64 previewing the essential ingredients, including an austere, cool palette, the hard-edged new double arrow symbol from the Design Research Unit, and the first sight of what would become the blue and grey carriage treatment. It was also the public cue for shortening British Railways to the crisper British Rail, with the set being toured widely and was photographed even more widely, seeding expectations among staff and passengers alike that something coherent, contemporary and, crucially, universal was about to replace the regional improvisations that had flourished since nationalisation. Although XB64's blue was fractionally lighter, standardization quickly followed, and in 1965 rail blue was formally introduced, though implementation, predictably, was messier than the guidelines, with the Mark II carriage family already entering production just as XB64's passenger-facing ideas were being tested, and thus several refinements only reached later builds, with early vehicles carrying interim details and signage that soon dated. Workshops had to adjust to new paint specifications, new masking practices for the grey window band, and new placements for logos and numerals, with stocks of obsolete transfers and tins of outgoing colours having to be run down before the switch could be complete. But despite this, from 1966, repaints accelerated, and the intended hierarchy began to appear on the network, with locomotives in all-over blue with black underframes and buffer beams, and mandatory yellow faces, and corridor coaching stock in blue with a broad pearl grey panel through the windows, edged by a subtle white keyline, while non-corridor and suburban multiple units largely went all blue. The last mainline locomotive to escape in pre-blue colours did so in August 1968, and thereafter the new look was effectively ubiquitous, with only a few departmental curiosities and industrial corners betraying the older palette, while Pullman's stock, which had long traded on a separate identity, was brought into the fold by inverting the standard arrangement, with grey bodysides with blue around the windows, thus preserving a sense of distinction without breaking the system. Even the celebrated blue Pullman sets, initially left in their own Nanking blue, were repainted into the reversed grey blue by 1969, aligning luxury with the corporate grid and smoothing the visual profile of flagship expresses, while on commuter routes, the gradual appearance of blue multiple units at previously multicoloured suburban termini gave ordinary travellers an everyday reminder that the railway was being remade in a common image. The programme reached well beyond paint, with stations shedding their colourful totem names and adopted black-on-white signage with new pictograms, transforming the atmosphere of platforms as surely as fresh liveries transformed passing trains, with the legibility of the new signs, combined with standardised sizes and placements, reducing local eccentricities and made wayfinding more predictable for occasional users. Staff uniforms began to reflect the house style, with early cuts still echoing older tailoring, but badged and buttoned with the double arrow, while ticket stock, posters, crockery, and even service vehicles were redrawn to sit comfortably inside the new visual framework, with the identity even reaching British Rail's ferries under the Sea-Link brand, which adopted blue hulls and pale grey uppers with the double arrow on rail red funnels. However, the first years exposed teething troubles, with early rail blue finishes chalking and fading, drifting lighter with time, a problem largely engineered out by the end of the decade as paint formulations improved and preparation standards tightened, while the disciplined palette also constrained costs, with plans to mount the double arrow on red panels being dropped in favour of white transfers, and rail red was rationed to buffet indicators and a few functional bands, keeping repaint simpler and material inventories leaner. As the programme matured, the 1970s saw both consolidation and experiment, and from 1974, refurbished diesel multiple units, particularly on provincial duties, emerged in a striking white with a bold blue bodyside band, a move that nodded to modernity, cleanliness and continental influence, but proved impractical given exhaust soot, oil haze and limited cleaning regimes outside the prestige routes. Within a few months of traffic, many of these units wore a veil of grey that defeated their intent, yet the experiment showed a railway willing to test the limits of its house style, while the baseline specification for coaching stock became more uniform, as previously all-blue suburban vehicles began to acquire the blue-grey arrangement that read as express only a few years earlier, softening the visual hierarchy across the network and giving commuter corridors a little of the mainline gravitas. Local pride and depot culture left their fingerprints on the standard look and ensured that blue never felt entirely anonymous, with Stratford's paint shops, already known for tidy presentation, making a minor trademark of grey roofs on certain classes, a subtle signature visible from overbridges and high platforms, while in 1977 it stepped into the national conversation with a celebratory flush, turning out 2 Class 47s with silver tops and full-height Union flags for the Silver Jubilee. Elsewhere, Eastern Region depots experimented with fine white waist stripes on Class 31s and white cab surrounds on Deltics, flashes of individuality that sat on top of rather than replaced the corporate canvas, with the latter being applied by Finsbury Park Depot on the East Coast Main Line to improve crew morale during a period when this facility faced closure. The corporate identity reached a confident peak in the middle of the decade with the arrival of the high-speed train, as introduced from 1976, with the Intercity 125 being visually transformed by Rail Blue, whose disciplined geometry complemented the wedge-front power cars and their sleek rake of Mark III coaches, while the double arrow, crisp and assertive, seemed made for these flanks, while extending the yellow warning panel rearwards in a diagonal that matched the nose gave the set a purposeful contemporary face that photographed well and read clearly at speed. The colour and the engineering worked together, as where earlier applications of blue could feel severe or even dour, the HST composition looked intentional and fast, and the interiors, which were plusher than much of the inherited fleet, rounded out this promise. And in combination with genuinely faster timings and markedly quieter, smoother running, the visual message finally aligned with the service reality, and intercity travel felt modern in a way the brand had long promised, but only intermittently delivered. By the decade's close, the uniformity began to loosen, and in 1978 the large logo treatment appeared on locomotives, scaling up the double arrow to near full bodyside height, an assertive gesture that suggested a railway newly proud of its own mark and keen to be legible at line-side distance and in photographs, while depot plaques and subsector badges started to creep in. However, during that same year, the advanced passenger train Class 370 electric prototypes made their debut in a completely different palette of dark and light grey, divided by red and white stripes, retaining the double arrow, but not the old corporate blue, being a declaration that top-tier intercity travel ought to look fast, purposeful and premium, rather than merely competent and utilitarian. The finish complemented the train's sharp geometry and promised a step change in experience, suggesting air travel ambitions on steel rails. And though the APT itself faltered as a technology package, dogged by teething troubles and a lack of political patience, its colours did not, with the visual language proving irresistible because it solved a branding problem that had been growing for years, how to signal that British Rail could be aspirational. In 1983, amid a business relaunch that tightened the intercity offer and tone of voice, the sector rolled that grey with red stripe image across conventional coaching stock and high-speed trains, displacing blue-grey from the flagship services that had defined British Rail to the public and the press, resulting in what was dubbed the Intercity Executive livery, but was also less commonly known as the Intercity Mainline livery. While freight also broke ranks during 1982, with rail freight setting aside Rail Blue for a severe dark grey on its locomotives that appeared to be a direct evolution of the earlier large logo blue. The decisive structural shift came in 1986 with sectorization, when British Rail reorganised its businesses into quasi-independent sectors with their own budgets, with the new structure formalising the different markets that demanded distinct propositions, and by the turn of the 1990s, blue and grey had largely vanished from the front line, with those examples that remained being mostly on weathered stock awaiting repaint, while the new sector brands matured and pushed further from their ancestor. Network Southeast in particular evolved so energetically that by 1991, its stations and trains bore virtually no visual relation to Rail Blue, while even units that had once carried the sober corporate scheme acquired vivid branding, swept stripes and bespoke topography, and stations that had long been defined by white and black signage were redressed with a brisk red, white and blue house style. Intercity Swallow, meanwhile, had bedded in as a confident device on trains that were redefining the railway's public image, pairing greys with fine linings that suggested movement and intent, while ScotRail took the same language and cooled it, substituting blue accents to signal a distinct territory without breaking the new grammar, all while rail freight began to develop the triple grey colours, a far more hard-wearing but corporatised aesthetic that matched its aspirations for channel tunnel work in the mid-1990s. Nevertheless, scruffy Class 31s or suburban units would continue to carry the remnants of the monastral paint well into the 1990s, while some locomotives actively retained Rail Blue for posterity, with one celebrity example being Tinsley-based Class 47, 47145 Meriden Emrys, which wore a unique monastral blue with Rail Freight General and later Rail Freight Distribution decals for the rest of its operational life. Elsewhere, the provincial network, as it morphed into regional railways, adopted patterns and colours that tried to make a virtue of localness, with the passenger transport executives layering their own colours on top in Merseyside, Greater Manchester and the West Midlands, sponsoring services that broadcast civic ownership as well as railway stewardship. Ultimately, in an official capacity, Rail Blue would disappear almost entirely by the year 2000, with the surviving examples being either heritage repaints, such as those undertaken by Virgin Trains in around 2001, or heritage locomotives such as Class 37s, 47s and 56s, stored out of use awaiting scrapping, Though in preservation, BR Blue would remain a favourite and could be found on a vast array of diesel-electric locomotives ranging from humble shunters to the former flagship haulage. Today, BR Blue represents a mixed period in British Rail's history, demonstrating during the 1960s all the aspirations and promises that were being developed to draw the company out of the archaic steam era and into the modern future, while by the 1970s, it had come to symbolise all that was wrong with BR and the many promises unfulfilled after decades of underfunding and malaise. Regardless, this uniform period from 1964 to 1986 represents a single moment when the British railway network was brought together under a single identity, and its innovation lives on today as the double arrow continues to be the defining public symbol for the railway network in the UK, a legacy that maintains the value of that original BR Blue scheme as developed way back in the 1960s.